So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar series, Lessons from Esplanada. My name is Paulo Vasconi Speroni. I hold a master's degree in public administration from Columbia University and two bachelor degrees, one in international affairs by PUC-Rio and another in social science from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Today, I have the pleasure of representing the Brazil Talk team, the webinar host organization. Brazil Talk is a global platform for in-depth discussions about Brazil at Columbia University. Our team is led by our Executive Secretary, Julia Diaz, and also includes other Columbian graduate students, as Renata Penalva and Gabriela Silvestrini from the Teachers College, Pedro Vormitag and Julia Leite from the School of International and Public Affairs. Two of my teammates will help me today by asking questions to our guest speaker. Fernanda Ferreira holds a bachelor degree in international affairs from the Federal Fluminense University, a master's degree in history and politics by Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and she's currently a graduate student in the sustainability program at Columbia University. Samit Stenberg holds two bachelor degrees in international affairs and social sciences from the University of Brasilia. He's currently a first-year student in the Masters of International Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Before describing today's talk, I want to thank our two longtime partners for making this event possible: the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Columbia University and the Lemann Foundation. Today is the opening session of the webinar series, Lessons from Esplanada. As the name already suggests, the series was designed to bring insights from former Brazilian ministers about the challenges and opportunities for our country in the income decade of 2020-2030. Today, to discuss relevant issues on global politics and the role played by our country in the multilateral and regional arena, I'm honored to introduce our eminent guest speaker, the former Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Antônio Patriota. Antônio de Aguiar Patriota has been a Brazilian career diplomat for 40 years. Between 1983 and 2003, he served at the Brazilian missions to the United Nations in Geneva and New York, as well as embassies in Beijing, China, and Caracas, Venezuela. Before being appointed as ambassador to Egypt, where his current resides, he was ambassador here in the United States between 2007 and 2009, deputy foreign minister in 2010, foreign minister between 2011 and 2013, permanent representative to the United Nations between 2012 and 2016, and ambassador to Italy between 2016 and 2019. Born in Rio de Janeiro in 1954, he graduated from the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy in 1979, after obtaining a degree in philosophy at the University of Geneva. In 2008, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in public service by Tatum University. He has published 2 volumes of speeches, articles, and interviews, covering his period as foreign minister of Brazil. Recent articles include Is the World Ready for Cooperative Multipolarity? Published in 2018 by SEBRE, the Brazilian Center of International Relations. And Collective Security and Collective Responsibility in the International Interventions, published in 2020 by the Polgraph Encyclopedia of Peace and Conflict Studies. Under the name of Tônio de Aguiar, he has recorded a CD of his compositions entitled Geografia do Sentimento, with the Brazilian sax player Léo Galdaman. So, after questions from the Brazil Talk team, Ambassador Patriota will answer some questions from the audience. So please feel free to write down your questions in the question and answer space on Zoom. Ambassador Patriota, thank you very much again for sharing your knowledge with us today. My first question is related to the Brazil's role in multilateral arena. In your career as diplomat, you have witnessed several moments of greater or lesser Brazilian activism in multilateral arena. Several autonomy paradigms were discussed during this period, such as autonomy by distance, participation, or diversification, to give only three preeminent examples. Since the 90s, for example, Brazil has tended to intensify participation in international organizations. How do you see our international insertion today and the critical areas that Brazil must explore during the next decade to reaffirm our preeminent role in the multilateral puzzles?
Well, let me start by saying that it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I am speaking in my personal capacity. As you know, I am still a career diplomat ambassador to Egypt right now, but I always learn a lot and enjoy discussions with young students, so I felt that this would be an opportunity to be in touch with, I'm sure, very promising students at Columbia and New York who will be holding important positions in the future. When you ask me about Brazil's participation in the multilateral sphere, I have had a very diverse experience. I served twice in Geneva, where I participated in GATT WTO discussions, including the launching of the Doha round. And I also worked 2 years with the human rights issues there. In New York, as a younger diplomat, I was twice a delegate to the Security Council in the 90s, and then ambassador to the UN for 3 years. What my experience demonstrates is that the voice of Brazil is extremely respected in the multilateral sphere because we have developed a capacity to, let's say, have a wide-ranging knowledge of the topics with good specialists on the different issues that are treated. We also, I think, demonstrate a good ability to express ideas with clarity without generating unnecessary polemics. And we have a characteristic that I think keeps people tuned to what we are about to say, is that we are rather unpredictable. This unpredictability has to do with our autonomy and independence in analyzing issues and establishing our own perspective. Now, this perspective that we develop reflects, I think, two basic concerns. Of course, national interest. How does this affect Brazil directly, whether it's economically, in trade, in the sphere of norm setting for human rights or in the peace and security sphere, but also how does a certain initiative or how do certain gaps in the existing mechanisms and body of law affect the international system itself. So Brazil has always been very engaged in ensuring that there is a level playing field, if you're talking about the multilateral trading system, that there is a fair consideration without selectivity or undue politicization if it comes to human rights, for example, that shouldn't only be directed towards countries in the South or certain types of countries. We have always also had a concern about the correct functioning of the entire peace and security chapter within the United Nations in New York and the Security Council in particular, with a special emphasis on respect for charter provisions. And even within this category, a very sustained attention towards respect for the provisions regarding coercive action. So whether that's sanctions or military intervention. Unfortunately, as you know, not everyone abides by the rules permanently. And there are attempts at creating waivers or introducing ideas that sometimes detract from the objective of disciplining the use of force and subjecting it to a rigorous international scrutiny. So within all these spheres, Brazil has had the capacity of contributing by participating constructively, in my opinion. But perhaps you should ask a few others also to have different perspectives. And Brazil is among a group of not very many countries that have diplomatic relations with every other single United Nations member. So currently 193 members plus 2 observers. There are about 15 countries at last count that have such universal diplomatic relations. What that creates is an ability to engage in dialogue with everyone without a pre-established or let's say prejudiced attitude. I would just as comfortably speak to the observer from the Vatican as I would speak to the ambassador of North Korea at the United Nations if I felt that I needed to convey a certain point of view or if I needed to understand a certain perspective. So that I think is a plus for us. The other aspect that I would highlight is that we are quite unique in Latin America in terms of how our diplomacy has evolved. We are quite unique in the fact that with very few exceptions, all ambassadors are career diplomats. Very often the foreign minister himself or herself, we haven't had a lady yet, but we should soon, is a career diplomat. And we have by far the largest network of embassies and missions abroad for our region. Just to give you an example, I'm now currently in Africa, where we have 35 embassies. So the next country with the largest number of embassies, you may be surprised to hear, is Cuba, with close to 28, 27, 28. But if you look at Mexico and Argentina, or the 2 or 3, or Colombia nowadays with a population larger than Argentina's, they have 1/3 the number of embassies that Brazil has in Africa. So we have more than 30, they're around 12 or even less. Now, for multilateralism, and the French often make this point, you can participate in multilateral affairs with better knowledge of the stakes in any discussion if you have a very wide net covering the world bilaterally. So to take peace and security, it makes a big difference if I have direct information on South Sudan, for example, or the Darfur question coming from our embassy in Khartoum, or if I have to rely on material that I've been able to obtain through the media or through reports presented by the United Nations Secretariat. I'll give you another example of a very simple feature in Brazilian diplomacy that is unique in Latin America and that often we put at the service, and we offer this as a service to Latin American colleagues who happen to sit in the Security Council, is we have a daily bulletin that we receive, and I receive it here in Cairo, just as all my colleagues around the world, with headlines or a very brief summary of the most important cables. We still call them cables, although they are transmitted through online, of course, through the internet, regarding different aspects of international reality. So our colleagues from very, very sophisticated diplomacies like Chile, they don't have something comparable. And when the Chilenos were in the Security Council, we placed a diplomat at the Brazilian mission in New York at their disposal. And we would share, once in a while, there may be something that is slightly confidential that we may censor and decide not to share. But on a regular basis, practically on a daily basis, we would share this daily bulletin. And all our Latin American colleagues who benefited from this information made very clear to us how valuable it had been. So I'm just giving you a little bit from my perspective, my experience, and also highlighting some of the aspects in which Brazilian diplomacy may differ from other diplomacies.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, Fernanda, please, you can make your question.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here. So I'd like to move in for a more cultural perspective. As we know today, several countries have adopted, discussed different types of identity to position themselves in the international systems. The Chinese professor Yan Shuotong, for example, proposed one of the many possible ideas, which would be the differentiation between more densely technological countries and less densely technological countries. His idea is that a technological edge is more powerful than an advantage in any other area. Another example would be the case of Brazil, which within the World Trade Organization framework decided to not classify itself as a developing country. In this context, I would like to hear from you about the relevance of the North-South identity in the world today. Does it still make sense to talk about global South or South-South relations? What's the role of these new identities in the world today? And what would be the next identity for Brazil? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, there are at least three important questions within this question, and maybe I'll separate them a little bit and say at the outset that I'll give a personal perspective that does not necessarily reflect official positions or the current state of discussions. So regarding the first suggestion by Mr. Yan Shuotong, I'm not sure what his position is in China. I lived in China as a junior diplomat, and I have many friends there, and I like the country very much, by the way. But I have to say that I found his proposition problematic. A proposition that offhand, without knowing more about it, I would not support in principle, because I find that these kinds of differentiation, more densely advanced in technology, less densely advanced, will end up discriminating against the broadest possible participation in discussing an issue that is of universal concern. Now, as we know, new technologies, they have their positive aspect, but they also have their malicious or ominous side. Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has recently spoken of the 4 horsemen of apocalypse that represent threats to our modern world. And one of the horsemen is precisely the ominous or the negative side of technological progress. Much of this technological progress is dual use. It can be used for peaceful purposes, but it can be used also for military or bellicose purposes. We need to be attentive, and we need to have as broad as possible a discussion on the different implications of whatever systems or rules or mechanisms are being discussed. So I would also consider that the United Nations is the ideal venue for a thorough and systematic examination of the international implications of these new technologies. This is already happening to some degree. I picked up a resolution 73/23, General Assembly's resolution, that deals with information telecommunications in the context of international security. I'd also like to mention here in passing, since I spoke of dual use technologies, and one with which we are familiar is nuclear technology. It has been with us for 75 years at least. And it was very interesting that on the United Nations Day on October 24th, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons achieved sufficient ratifications, 50 ratifications, for it to automatically come into force in the next 90 days. Why do I mention this treaty? Because it is a pioneer example of something that may become a new feature of multilateral negotiations in the future. And I would be very much in favor of this. This treaty would not have come to life if it had not been the active campaign by a civil society coalition called ICANN. You are familiar with them. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, the International Coalition for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. They are the ones who provoked, pressured, worked with a number of delegations, first at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and then in New York, to push forward a text that was subject to a lot of pressure in the opposite direction and pushback from the nuclear weapon states, from countries that are part of defense alliances that foresee resort to nuclear weapons. Notwithstanding, this treaty came into being. Now, I'm under no illusion that this treaty will eliminate any nuclear weapons at all. But the fact that it exists helps to establish norms and a process of delegitimization that can, in the medium term, or even before, sooner than many might imagine, lead countries to start thinking twice about their policies. So this is an example of something that I think is very new, interesting, and positive for countries that are committed to a world without nuclear weapons. And as you know, Brazil was active in this negotiation. Brazil was the first country to sign it. We have yet to ratify it. And Brazil, in its constitution, has outlawed the use of nuclear technology for military purposes or for other than peaceful purposes. Thank you. Well, that was the first part of the question. The second part has to do with North-South, the Global South, WTO, the category of developing country within the WTO. I have a few thoughts to share with you on this topic that go a little bit along the following lines. First of all, the fact that there have been now for several decades provisions allowing for more favorable treatment for developing countries in the WTO does not mean that the system does not remain very much tilted in favor of developed countries in general. And historically, you have had entire categories of products like textiles that were submitted to special rules that in fact discriminated in favor of developed countries and against low-wage textile exporters that were considered as market disruptors because their products were much cheaper. In the agricultural field, we all know that export subsidies and other subsidies that have been resorted to by developed countries have distorted international markets to the detriment also of the potential for growth for developing countries. So these provisions on more favorable treatment for countries of the South, they were an attempt to help to level the playing field, where the playing field continues to be rather lopsided in favor of the developed world. Now, that is one thought. A second thought is that it is unquestionable that many countries that were very poor 40, 50 years ago when the GATT was created and even as WTO succeeded the GATT, today are on their way to becoming, to be placed among the 10 largest economies of the world. I'm thinking of China. China already #1 in PPP terms, and within a few years, probably in nominal terms as well. India already #5 in GDP nominal terms, and in PPP #2 or 3. Let's say Brazil is among the 10 largest economies, and living here in Africa as I do now, and seeing how Egypt is a country of relative development, but its GDP is 1/6 that of Brazil. Per capita income here is 1/3 that of Brazil, and yet it is one of the richest countries in Africa. So you can see the disparities that exist within the developing world. In that sense, these categories, they are all encompassing, and they include countries with very different profiles. It is one thing to be a least developed country from Africa. It is another entirely different reality to have the possibilities offered to an economy like the Brazilian economy, or the Chinese, or the Indian, or even the Indonesian. I do not feel that it is inappropriate to have a discussion about what it means to be a developing country. And in that sense, I would be open to such a discussion, and I think it would be a necessary ingredient in what many believe is a necessary effort to update the WTO, including in order to keep some important trading powers as the United States interested in the system. Because the risk you run is that if it is perceived as out of date and out of sync with today's realities, countries will just go their own way and abandon the system as such. Another element, and I would add this as a third thought before I conclude on the North-South and the Global South part of the question, is that I believe that the WTO is being unnecessarily hampered by the consensus rule. As you know, although it is technically possible to vote the WTO, this never occurs. And it is a consensus rule that is preventing the organization from appointing judges to the appellate body. And the appellate body is an essential piece of the dispute settlement system of the World Trade Organization. So within this new bargain that could be struck, that might include, let's say, a revision of what is a developing country and what is not a developing country, I think you would need to review the consensus rule as well. But for as long as there is no comprehensive discussion on what I might call a new bargain within the multilateral trading system, I believe that the current categories will continue to exist. So yes, you will continue to speak about developing countries, about the South, about global South, about North-South. These categories will not disappear easily, even though we are experiencing a transition where a new reality is emerging that might render some of the thinking along those lines rather obsolete, I would say. So I was a little bit diplomatic, but I think you got a sense of my thinking. And the third is actually the aspect that I found the most interesting in this question, which is how does a country establish its identity internationally, right? And here I may speak for what may seem a little bit lengthy period, because I'd like to develop a few ideas with all of you. Now, I would start by suggesting that a country's international profile and the way it is perceived or the way it interacts internationally involves at least three important aspects. One of them is the military power of the country. The other is the economic power. And the third would be what I would call the political or diplomatic influence that the country enjoys. And it's always interesting to look at lists of, for example, the 20 biggest military budgets to have a sense of how the world fares in terms of defense matters and peace and security matters. And here, of course, as you are aware, the United States is an incredible, disproportionate, is completely in a category of its own, with a budget that is equivalent to that of practically the rest of the entire world, some put together. But it's interesting to see that Brazil is among, let's say, the 12 or 15 biggest military budgets and has a strong military. However, I think it's important to note that Brazil does not aspire to be perceived as a military power because of historic, geographic, and political reasons. We live in a comparatively peaceful region. We have established borders through negotiations. It's one of the reasons why diplomacy is so important in Brazil, as you are aware. We don't have enemies. We may have tensions. Right now, I would say there are tensions with Venezuela, for example, but this is different from the situation between India and Pakistan, for example, completely different. Or between the Baltic countries and the Russian Federation. So this is an important point to start looking at our identity. As I mentioned before, we have diplomatic relations with every single country in the world. We are banned by our constitution to develop nuclear weapons. And I would also submit, this is a strong opinion that I have, that we should look at cooperation with defense alliances that foresee resort to nuclear weapons with great caution, because there is a constitutional issue at hand in this respect. And I think you understand what I'm trying to drive at. So if you look at economic power, I think, again, Brazil is among sometimes the 10 largest economies by GDP. I think now with COVID and the recession, we will drop to maybe 11th or 12th position. We have been in the 8th position. Be that as it may, we're part of the G20, and we are considered an important economic player internationally. Yes, Brazil does like to present itself as a country that is active on the financial, trade, economic front. In fact, I will come back to this point a little bit later, because I think it's one of the few aspects in which we have a national consensus when it comes to foreign policy. Even as recently as today, there was an editorial in the Folha de São Paulo criticizing a speech made by the foreign minister during the Dia do Diplomata, the Day of the Diplomat, And that concludes by saying, we should be concentrating all our energy in what is the priority for Brazilian diplomacy, namely negotiating free trade agreements or opening up new markets for our products. And thirdly, we have the diplomatic sphere, where I would submit that Brazil has achieved considerable influence. Influence in diplomacy is not very easy to measure. You don't have a GDP, a rule, or military budget, but there are some quantitative elements. I mentioned the number of embassies, the number of diplomats, only career diplomats, the number of embassies in your capital is also something worth looking at. And you may be surprised to hear that Cairo has more embassies than any Latin American capital. There are more foreign embassies in Cairo, in Egypt, than in Brasilia, which is the capital with the largest number of foreign embassies. There are about 138 in Brazil. There are more than 140 in Cairo. So these are measures of some diplomatic relevance, maybe not necessarily influence, but diplomatic relevance. And I think that in the kind of world we're evolving towards, which is more multipolar, I don't call it completely multipolar, because in the military sphere, one country has a disproportionate amount of resources to influence outcomes. That's the United States. Even though it is discovering, as it did in Iraq and other places, that it has great difficulty in determining outcomes through military force. So how useful is it to have such a huge military and such a big budget in today's world is a question for Americans to answer and us to ponder. Now getting back to why diplomatic influence. Yes, and this is an area, diplomacy, where Brazil has demonstrated an ability not only to say no to things we don't like, and I can assure you that through my experience at the UN and other places, if there are initiatives that we feel are inequitable, against our national interest, we will coalesce and we will prevent them from going ahead. There's a question further down the road on Security Council reform. And this is a good example of how Brazil, with India, Japan, and Germany, not with Japan and Germany initially, but Brazil and India managed to prevent a quick fix expansion of the Security Council that was very much in the minds of some countries in the 1990s. But I always defend the idea that it's not sufficient to say no. You also have to be able to propose ideas, to be creative. And in this sense, I could give examples of several imaginative aspects of Brazilian diplomacy in the three pillars in which we usually divide multilateral activity here in New York, there in New York at the United Nations, which are peace and security, sustainable development or development, and human rights. And we can talk about that a little bit further down the road. But the thought I'd like to leave with you, I already started articulating it, is that in Brazil, you have a consensus regarding the importance of engaging internationally in the trade, economic, financial sphere. The election of Roberto Azevedo to be Director General of the WTO was universally applauded in Brazil. Nobody said, oh, why is Brazil aspiring to head the WTO? It was kind of obvious to everyone, and everyone felt that this was a worthy objective. And of course, it was not an easy task, and it happened under my watch. I dedicated a lot of energy and effort, and we were successful. I think the FAO candidacy also, let's say, filled more or less the same criteria and was seen as justifiable. But the curious thing is that Brazil is not as big a trading partner as many would imagine. In fact, we're not among the 20 largest exporters in the world. There are much smaller countries like Thailand, Poland, Switzerland, Belgium that export much more than we do. There are many countries for which international trade represents a larger proportion of GDP. And yet, Brazil is to some degree considered an important player in these affairs. I think it's a curious piece of information to bear in mind. And then if you come to other aspects of the work carried out internationally through UN or other organizations, namely peace and security and human rights, you fall into a much more tricky debate internally. There are many voices in Brazil who question the insistence that we have demonstrated in a Security Council reform that includes new permanent members, and Brazil, of course, presenting itself as a potential new permanent member. There were many voices in Brazil that questioned our involvement in the Iranian nuclear file when we got involved, even though we produced a successful result along with Turkey. And I would submit that differently from trade, where we are not among the 20 most significant exporters, when it comes to peace and security, we are a country that has a lot of authority to speak, because we're not at war with anyone. We have contributed to an environment of cooperation within our own region. We have foregone nuclear weapons, but this is not part of our national psyche to the extent that I would like to see it become. I'm very much in favor of Brazil playing a more active role in these spheres, because I have experienced firsthand how Brazil is capable of producing better outcomes than would have been the case if we had not become involved. Let's put it that way. So to conclude, after this kind of long digression, when you ask about our identity, my preference would be for Brazil to define itself, if we needed to establish some kind of category, because these categories are, of course, arbitrary to some degree, as a country with global influence, by opposition of a country with regional or sub-regional influence. Now, how do you measure a global influence? There are military aspects, there are economic aspects, there are diplomatic aspects. There is a desire also, or an aspiration to engage internationally, which is not quantifiable, but ultimately comes down to leadership exercised by certain governments at different historic periods in our evolution. And here it is interesting to note, there was an interview, I'll conclude with these two almost anecdotal stories. First of all, when I was ambassador to the United States, then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice made a trip to Latin America. When she returned to Washington, she invited all the Latin American ambassadors for a breakfast meeting. And she described, what she had done in Chile and Brazil. I think there were 4 or 5 countries. There were larger countries, smaller countries. There may have been an English-speaking Caribbean. And when she described Brazil to this regional audience, she said, of course, Brazil, as you know, today is a country of global influence. So I call attention to this anecdote or this episode, because I believe it may have been the first time in our history, in our diplomatic history, when the United States described Brazil in such a way. And it was a little bit as a consequence of the multiple initiatives that were being undertaken during the Lula government, the number of embassies that were being opened, the new coalitions such as the IBSA or the Arab South American summits and everything else that were probably in her mind. And then a few years later, President Dilma Rousseff, I was no longer foreign minister, by the way, I was ambassador to the UN. She visited Washington with, I think Luis Alberto Figueiredo was the foreign minister. And there was a press conference next to President Obama. And a Brazilian reporter asked, Madam President, do you consider Brazil a country of regional or global influence? And I don't know if you remember this or if any of you have watched this interview, but there was an almost amusing moment when Obama said, wait, I want to answer that question. And his answer was, Brazil is unquestionably a country of global influence. So I'm not saying that we need a rubber stamp from Washington to determine whether we have global influence or not. But I think it's an interesting perspective to have, that not only have we acquired this influence, but we are also perceived as having acquired that influence. Now, what that entails is a high level of responsibility. And I will conclude on that note.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, Sami, please, can you please do your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you again, Ambassador, for sharing your knowledge with us. I'd like to take part of your previous answer and your argument that Brazil has authority to talk about peace and security in the multilateral arena to ask a question about the United Nations system and the evident need to improve it. So as the head of the permanent mission of Brazil to the United Nations, you monitor the debates on the reform of the UN and specifically the reform of the United Nations Security Council. I would like to ask you, what's the current situation of this debate and what's your opinion on the development of this agenda during the next decade? What will be the role of Brazil to push these topics forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I have already touched on this to some degree. The current status is paralysis, but paralysis cannot last forever. In fact, paralysis in international relations never lasts forever. So this is a momentary paralysis, and I would submit that at some point, the expansion in the membership of the Security Council will become inevitable. Now, the exact event or the exact trigger for this to happen is not clear to me yet. But I often resort to a very simple comparison to highlight how this reform has really become overdue and necessary. When the 2008 financial crisis hit the world, again, I'll share with you a little bit of my personal experience because I think this is maybe what makes the conversation more lively. I was ambassador to the United States and I offered a dinner to the then Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson. Some of you may remember him. And I remember him telling me, this is probably in a cable that we wrote subsequently, him telling me, you know what, this crisis is really global in scope, and we need to expand the G7 because it has become pointless to meet in a kind of like-minded group, even though I think maybe at the time Russia was participating as G8, or even with Russia, but without China, without the larger economies in the developing world and so on, India, Brazil, and others. So we will be very much pushing for an expansion of the G7. And as you know, it was under President George W. Bush and under the watch of Hank Paulson that the G7 became the G20. Now, that expansion could take place just by a joint decision. It did not involve an amendment to any charter or ratification of the amendment by any parliaments around the world. So it was a comparatively simple process. But I would say that the kind of situation we are facing today in the world, and I would recommend that you take a look at Antonio Guterres' 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse speech, because it's a good kind of diagnosis. To summarize, the 4 Horsemen are geopolitical tensions, climate change, unequal globalization or rising inequality, and the negative side of technological progress. Recently, he's been mentioning a 5th horseman that is not even in the Bible, and that's the pandemic. But the pandemic is more like an enabler that has exposed some of these other vulnerabilities and difficulties. Now, under normal circumstances, it would be difficult to coordinate internationally on all these issues. As we are aware, that it is right now. But it becomes more difficult if you are facing a geopolitical transition without historic precedent. I mean, the United States has been the #1 economy since the end of the 19th century. So for approximately 150 years. And possibly during my lifetime, but certainly during your lifetime, you will witness China becoming the new #1 economic power in the world, and a country also that is enhancing its international footprint through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Asian Development Bank. Those are regional initiatives, but also through the occupation of important positions within the multilateral sphere. They now are head of FAO, they're head of the International Telecommunications Union, as well as UNIDO and others. So this is very new. This creates a lot of anxiety in the United States. You are living in the United States and following the electoral campaign. And one thing that kind of surprises me is the degree of anti-Chinese sentiment that you see across the aisle. I mean, it's not only the Republicans, the Democrats also. And I think this anxiety has less to do with China than with the fact that the US is not used to being #2 in anything. And they will have to become used. I mean, there's no amount of Make America Great Again slogans that will prevent China from becoming the #1 economy. And that shouldn't be seen as necessarily something that will make Americans more unhappy. Americans will continue to enjoy a much higher standard of living, formidable universities such as the ones where you study, exceptional technological progress, and other features that we know and that we admire. Cultural strength of the United States is something that Brazilians are very much familiar with, and the music, the literature, everything else. We feel comfortable with, and we like, and we admire. So, but my point is that if you are confronting such big challenges, global warming, inequality, etc., under geopolitical shift of this magnitude, you need mechanisms that are inclusive to discuss peace and security issues. And the Security Council, as it is today, is not sufficiently inclusive. Brazil is the developing country, and here I'm using an established category, that has sat for the greatest number of years as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. We've been there 10 times. So that's 20 years in 75, a history of 75. So we hold the record. And in these 20 years, there's something we learned. We learned that no matter how specialized you are, how effective you are as a diplomatic corps, I mentioned, for example, the network we have and the bulletin that we receive, the high quality information we have about all the conflicts around the world that few others have. No matter how creative you are, and you can, for example, take a look at the Iranian initiative with Turkey that was not well received by the permanent members. As a non-permanent member, it's difficult to make a difference because you're there for 2 years. So by the time you have completely mastered the new files, because you've been absent for 5 or 6 or sometimes 10 years. So by the time you really develop the necessary expertise, several months have gone by. By the time you have elaborated or articulated an original proposal, you have already met with other initiatives by some of the permanent members to which you have to respond. So very often you have to be reactive rather than creative and imaginative. Nevertheless, Brazil has demonstrated capacity to be imaginative. And I think some of you may be familiar with the Responsibility While Protecting initiative. That is actually my personal creation and idea. And it's very gratifying for me to see how many universities around the world are interested in this to this very day. I was invited here in Cairo to speak at the American University about this proposal. Because why does this generate interest, and why am I still invited today? because it's creative, it's a little bit outside the box, and it deconstructs some of the assumptions that a ready-made product placed on your table by more developed countries seem to uphold. Many countries said, oh, but Brazil didn't follow through sufficiently with this initiative. Of course, we're not permanent members. We're there for 2 years, then we're outside. We continue to make speeches in the open sessions, but our ability to make a difference is very much curtailed by not sitting there permanently. So in my opinion, and I go back to my initial comment, it's paralyzed. The paralysis will end at some point. Reform is inevitable, but we have to recognize that although there's an overwhelming majority in favor of expansion in both permanent and non-permanent categories, a very effective minority has been preventing this from going ahead. So, there are blocking minorities at the UN and within the UN system that actually succeed for more than 20 years in stalling a debate. But I am convinced that this will be temporary and that at some point we will see movement.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, before we move to the question and answers from the audience, I want to do a last question for you. And I want to talk a little bit about the concept of bandwagoning and how it applies to Brazilian reality. In few words, in international relations, bandwagoning occurs when a state aligns with a stronger power and concedes uneven gains in the spoil they conquer together. We already experience this strategic development association in international politics in Korea, Japan, and other countries. Can a bandwagoning relationship inspire Brazilian foreign policy or not? Would Brazil's relationship with the United States today be an example of this concept taking place? And since you mentioned the upcoming elections in the United States, how do you think the results can impact our relationship with them? Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I was looking forward to this question because this question allows me to do something that I have been describing that Brazilians often do in international debates, which is taking a concept that has received some credibility internationally and looking at it from an innovative angle and actually questioning the usefulness of that concept. I would start by saying that I'm not sure if this idea of so-called bandwagoning has much meaning in a multipolar world. I think it had relevance during the Cold War, where you had the real threat of a nuclear confrontation between two major blocs that were antagonistic between each other. And many countries felt that they were unprotected from a security point of view if they did not fall in under one or the other umbrella to some degree, or the protection of one or the other superpower. But in a more multipolar world in which power is more diffused, in which nuclear war continues to be inconceivable for humanitarian reasons, and also for the simple reason that it would entail extraordinary damage even for the power that resorts to offensive nuclear bombing itself. So a very irrational option. And where we have seen that political outcomes from military intervention are very often very different from the intended outcome. We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in Libya. I don't have to give more examples. To some degree, Afghanistan. 20 years later, the Taliban will probably take power in Afghanistan. So, how useful was this investment in military strategies? I believe that this idea of so-called bandwagoning loses a lot of importance. And for Brazil, I would submit that it really almost doesn't apply. I think bandwagoning is conceivable for weak countries. So you mentioned Japan and Korea. Japan after World War II was a destroyed country. It had very few options. Either it submitted entirely to the sphere of influence of the United States and accepted some degree of tutelage, or it would be destining itself to international irrelevance. And we know that they jumped back brilliantly, and their strategy probably worked for them. But it started from a very weak, vulnerable position. The same with Korea. The Korean War split the Korean Peninsula in two. The country was destroyed. Korea was an extremely poor country, something Ban Ki-moon used to remind us when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, became an economic powerhouse. And so for those kinds of countries, there's a certain meaning. But for a country without enemies, that is part of denuclearized region under the Treaty of Tlatelolco, has diplomatic relations with the entire world, does not feel particularly threatened. I don't see any interest in traditional bandwagoning. Our big challenges, as we know, are inequality, social injustice, high criminality in some of our cities, infrastructure that has become inadequate, sustainability. Bandwagoning with a big power will not help us in achieving any of these objectives. So I just find that the concept itself would not really apply in today's world. It would apply less than before, and to Brazil it does not apply at all. In fact, I would think it would be almost a mistaken approach to, now, this does not mean that we do not have very close relations with the United States right now. You are right in pointing that out. But it's interesting also for you students of international relations or other topics that deal with international matters to look at many of the other, let's say, profiles that Brazil has. Brazil has recently joined a BRICS communique of foreign ministers that describes the kind of world we'd like to see. And I think I have a quotation here. The ministers called for enhanced efforts to establish a more fair, just, inclusive, equitable, representative, multipolar international system based on the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention in their internal affairs, cooperation and mutual respect for interests and concerns of all. Now, does this seem compatible with bandwagoning or automatic alignment with any big power? I don't think so. And this communique is only 2 months old. So sometimes the media distorts a little bit what's happening, and you get the impression that there's, in fact, a stronger alignment with the US than is actually the case. As you know, trade with the US has been going down, just as trade with China is going up, and our surplus with China considerable. And we have diversified relations to the point where we have so-called strategic partnerships with, I believe, more than 20 countries. We have a strategic partnership with China. We have a strategic partnership with Russia. We have a strategic partnership with Nigeria, with the European Union. And lo and behold, we don't have a strategic partnership with the United States. This was never considered as something that would be beneficial to our bilateral relations, although we do have other joint initiatives. And we've enjoyed, in fact, very good relations during different periods, including the period when President Lula was in power and I was ambassador in Washington. President Lula was invited to a weekend at Camp David, which is something that is reserved to very few heads of state, as you know. I'm not sure if this is in the cards for the current government, depending on the outcome of the US election. We'll see what happens. At the same time, there's something that I wish to share with you that comes from my experience as ambassador in Italy, and that I find interesting. As you know, 25,000 troops, Brazilian troops, fought during World War I in Italy. And there are several ceremonies every year in which we pay tribute to the close to 500 soldiers who died. There's it's a very touching cemetery, and I would encourage you to visit near Florence in Pistoia. in tribute to these soldiers. And you can still run into Italians who say wonderful things about the Brazilian soldiers. You know, they shared the little food they had. They were very humane. They had, it's remembered as a positive and inspiring episode in our military history, in our diplomatic or overall history in general. The performance that is considered positive by Brazilian troops during World War II in Italy with the Allies would not have been possible if not under the umbrella of the United States. So in this very circumscribed episode that I'm sharing with you, I believe there was something of the nature of bandwagoning when we joined World War II, and we're very proud of that as the only Latin American country that sent troops to fight alongside the Allies. And yet, here is what I find curious. When I was ambassador to Italy, I used to ask myself, why don't we invite an American to our ceremonies? Marshal Mascarenhas de Moraes, who was the commander of the Brazilian troops, he had extremely friendly relations with the an American general called Krittenberger, who, let's say, gave the overall strategy for Brazilian participation. So I happen to know the daughter of General Krittenberger, who's a US diplomat. I wrote to her and I said, would you be ready to participate in one of these ceremonies? I know that your father had a special love for Brazil and he appreciated Brazilian soldiers. And she said, oh, nothing would give me greater pleasure. And I proposed this to my authorities, but I was not encouraged to pursue this. So it's very curious how countries have their own contradictions, not just as human beings. And sometimes we like to be seen as, or perceived as especially close to another group of countries or to a big power, when in fact we resist simple symbolic initiatives that will celebrate our historic collaboration. It's still a source of some perplexity for me. So this is my take on bandwagoning. There was another part to this question that I'd like to come to if you allow me, which is you ask who is the current hegemon, right? And to make my answer short, I would just recommend very highly a book by two American political scientists, Richard Ned Lebo, some of you may know him, and Simon Reich. And the book is called Goodbye, Hegemony. I happen to believe, and this is a little bit my idealistic streak, that we don't need a hegemon. And in fact, in a multipolar world, we have an opportunity to discredit the idea of hegemony. And this is something that a country like Brazil could do, I think, brilliantly if we applied our diplomatic skills to it. I'm not sure if right now this is something that is in the cards, but maybe in the future. And there's academic research and thinking behind it that would very much support us, because the point that these two political scientists make, that I find a very powerful one, is that exercising hegemony, and for example, those Americans who insist on primacy for the United States and feel threatened by a rising China in the Pacific and so on. But one corollary of this attitude is that you are perceiving international relations in an undemocratic manner. So the conclusion in their book is that hegemony is ultimately incompatible with democracy. And I think what we should strive for in a country like Brazil, has been a strong advocate for this, is rendering international relations as democratic as they can be. And I'll conclude on a little personal note. When I wrote some of the opening speeches for different presidents who opened the general debate at the General Assembly, and you will find the sentence in there in 2 or 3 speeches, I say that those who uphold democracy domestically should also uphold democratic systems internationally. So as inclusive and as plural with as little differentiation as possible between those who wield veto rights, for example, in the Security Council. This is the march of civilization, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing some of your perspectives on how our foreign policy should be. And now we only have 15 minutes left, and we have several questions from the audience, and we're gonna try to go over some of them, but I'm afraid we will not be able to cover everyone's questions, so we're sorry about that. But I would like to go with the first one, which is from Guilherme Barros, and he asks, diplomats from the Rio Branco Institute are outstanding public servants. However, our diplomats' gender and racial diversity does not reflect the Brazilian demographics due to several existing barriers, which prevent underrepresented populations from dreaming of a diplomatic career and holding leadership positions in embassies and international organizations. In your perspective, what are the most significant barriers to racial and gender diversity in the diplomatic career in Brazil? And how could Brazil have more Blacks, Indigenous, and women representing the country internationally?
Well, first of all, I agree with Guilherme Barros. The composition of our diplomatic corps does not reflect our racial diversity and is insufficiently inclusive in terms of gender. But this is not the privilege of diplomacy. This is the way Brazilian society functions. If you look at the government in general, I don't think we have a single Afro-Brazilian minister at present. The number of women, female ministers in the cabinet is very limited, very reduced. We don't have a very good performance. Our performance is quite bad when it comes to the parliament, the percentage of women who are elected to the Chamber of Deputies and to the Senate, even lower than in a country like Egypt, where you have the Muslim religion that is, let's say, less conducive to promoting gender equality. So this is a big challenge for Brazil. I think it's one of the most important social challenges for the future, for the society in general. And I would very much like to see some more ambitious affirmative action initiatives to allow our foreign ministry to be more diverse. Some projects already have been in place, including one that was established by Minister Celso Amorim, under whom I worked for many years, as you know. These were grants afforded to African descendants in order to help them prepare for the examination. Now, it's not a quota per se, but it's a, let's say, an assistance for those interested in entering the diplomatic corps that will diminish their disadvantage, their economic or social disadvantage. I'm not sure even if this program is still in force. But the truth is that we have had some degree of success. I'll share with you another, maybe a slightly different take on this issue. I find that the transfer of the capital from Rio to Brasilia itself had a very positive impact in making our diplomatic corps more diverse and inclusive, because when it was in Rio, the average diplomat used to come from Rio or Sao Paulo. This was the truth, with a very small minority from the Northeast. And whoever wanted to enter the career would have to move first to Rio in order to pass the examination. When the capital was moved to Brasilia, and the Rio Branco was moved to Brasilia in the late 70s, the examination started being organized in all the state capitals. So already in my class, and this was 40 years ago, there were students from Rio Grande do Sul, from Bahia, from Pará, from all over. And when I was foreign minister, I once visited the Rio Branco, and I was surprised to discover that there was a class with a majority of students from Minas Gerais. This is the first time it ever happened in the history of the Rio Branco. So, of course, we don't want a majority from any state, but the fact that the composition is changing geographically is something positive in itself, but there is quite a long way to go in terms of racial diversity. I would only add that this is also the case, unfortunately, in many other countries that have large African descendant minorities, with very few exceptions.
Thank you, Ambassador. We also have a good question from Rafaela Marinho. She says, in the past, Brazil's health public system has been seen as a global reference. Now, how has the pandemic influenced our international perception on the global health stage?
Well, I think the Sistema Único de Saúde, the universal healthcare coverage in Brazil, is still considered as a big achievement by the Brazilian government and in tune with aspirations from Brazilian society. I haven't been living in Brazil now for almost 6 years, but if it weren't for the pandemic, I would have gone several times this year. I usually go 2-3 times to Brazil, and of course, thanks to WhatsApp and email and everything, I'm in contact with many people. I have a house in Bahia, so I'm told by my friends in Bahia, for example, that if it had not been for the SUS, for the universal healthcare system, the pandemic there would have been much more disastrous and lethal than it ultimately has been. So to some degree, I think we compare favorably with even a country like the United States, whereas we know there is no universal healthcare, and some others also in our part of the world. In other aspects, I think I would be entering very controversial waters if I expressed exactly what my views are. But let's say that I think there is some dissatisfaction with the way the pandemic has been dealt with by the Brazilian government. And I think this dissatisfaction is to some degree justified. I am not a public health specialist. My wife studied public health at Columbia, actually, and worked with UNFPA for 25 years. So she has her own specific ideas on this. But I believe that, yes, there would be reason for some criticism of, let's say, the strategy or absence of strategy to deal with the pandemic.
Thank you, Ambassador. So we are going to finish our talk with an anonymous question. In a few words, what is the most important piece of advice you would give to the future ministers of foreign affairs of Brazil in the upcoming decade?
To preserve and enhance Brazil's global influence.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing your perspectives about Brazilian foreign affairs with us today. I am sure that all of us here learn a lot more from listening to you. And on behalf of Brazil Talk team and our longtime partners, the Institute of Latin America Studies in Columbia University and the Lemann Foundation, I thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk, and congratulations for the excellent questions and the very good organization. Hope to meet you in person sometime.
Yeah, thank you. And so to finish, my friends, next week on November 4, same day, same time, we have the next chapter of the Lessons from Esplanada, our webinar series, with the Public Safety former Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Raul Jungmann. So please join us. You can find more information about the upcoming event in our social media and in our website, braziltalk.org. And if you want to contribute to Brazil Talk by writing articles or suggesting guest speakers, please reach us in our social media channels. Last but not least, This event is part of the Brazil on Campus program, which is a student engagement program for students and scholars at Columbia University, Harvard, MIT, Oxford, and Stanford, which is supported by Lemann Foundation. In addition to events like this one, participants from the Brazilian campus will be able to apply for Lemann Foundation's Leaders Network upon graduation. So be part of it. If you haven't signed it yet, we will share the link of the program in our social media channels so you can find more information about that. Thank you, everybody who attended to our event. Thanks again, Fernando and Sami, for our support. And a special thanks for Ambassador Patriota.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.